Hey everybody, and welcome back to Dude's Brunch, a podcast about pop culture, internet garbage, and black coffee. I'm your host, Taylor Olmstead, and with me this week, like every week, or most every week, it's Tyler Reed. Tyler, what do you have for brunch today?
Good morrow, scholars. Today for brunch, I got to get out, had something a little different. We had a work meeting early at the Ask Racket Dawn, and so my good friend Michael Brown might be listening to the show. I don't actually know.
What time is the Ass Crack of Dawn?
8 a.m.
When would
When you close at 2 a.m. and you get up at 8 a.m., you're like, it might as well be hell o'clock. Sub 8 hours of sleep it might as well be 4 a.m. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so we went to Nation. Nation is a burger place. I had a brunch wrap supreme, which is, for the audience out there, I air quoted vigorously because it's not a very funny joke. And so like it was formatted like a crunch wrap, but it was very small. It was very burger like. It had like a good jalapeno relish and a side of like ranch, like a special ranch kind of sauce. So it was like pretty good. Not a lot for the amount of money I paid, but it was pretty good. I would say it was definitely a high quality thing. I had a mimosa, which is God's gift to the world.
Shawn Evans is here. Shawn, what did you have for brunch today?
What did I have? I know I had coffee, and I feel like I had something else, but I don't remember what it was. It wasn't cookies or anything, though. I know that. Like, it wasn't something that was, like, really... It was at least coffee. We'll just go with coffee. I just had coffee.
Well, I'm your host, Taylor, and for brunch this morning, I had coffee and 2 pieces of toast with homemade apple butter at, like, 11:45 a.m., because yesterday was my birthday, and this morning was difficult. So, I gotta ask you guys a question. Do you guys want to go see a dead body?
No.
Because we're here tonight to talk about one of my favorite movies of all time, 1986's Stand By Me, directed by Robert Reiner.
I'm ready to see a dead body, Taylor. I'd fucking love to see a dead body. Wait, no, that's weird. Hold on.
Go piss up a rope, Tyler.
That's a contextual reference for the movie. But seeing this is the first time I've seen the movie, I can't make those jokes.
For people who haven't seen this movie, very brief plot synopsis. It's a man looking back at a moment in his childhood where he and his 3 friends went off into the woods in search of a local kid who had been missing for a few days, and they thought that his body was somewhere next to the train tracks. And so their goal is to go find this body and, like, get the fame and reward of being the people who find this missing kid. And that's ostensibly what the movie's about, but it's kind of one of these like slice of life movies that's about a whole lot of things, and the plot is just kind of there to deliver the characters, so to speak. And the cast of this movie is really interesting because it's a lot of people who ended up becoming very famous when they were, but in this movie they're very, very young. So Will Wheaton is the main character. He was 14 at the time they shot it. River Phoenix is his best friend. River Phoenix, of course, tragically died in the mid-90s, but was in a bunch of other movies. Corey Feldman is one of the kids. And Kiefer Sutherland of 24 fame is the rival gang leader. That's kind of like the antagonist of this movie.
Ace Miro.
Yeah.
Who later started a boot company.
Yeah, exactly. So before we walk through the plot of the movie and what our thoughts are, I just wanted to hear, do you guys have any experience with this movie? Obviously, I kind of led my hand at the beginning that this is a really important movie for me and one that I've watched countless times.
Well, this is a movie. I saw it when I was a kid.
And if you're following the plot of the Shawn Evans narrative, Shawn was forced to watch lots of movies as a child because, I don't know, babysitters didn't exist. This didn't happen. They're like, just watch Star Wars, and has forever scarred Shawn.
This was the 90s when you didn't have babysitters. You just sat down in front of the TV, and now look at us. We're all stunted human beings.
Well, that's dark and depressing.
No, I'm just kidding. We're all fine. It's great. I didn't know this was a Stephen King movie, though, to be honest. Just until I read this.
Yeah, it's based on a novella that Stephen King wrote. The story is that a critic said Stephen King can only write horror, and so he wrote 2 non-horror short stories, and this was one of them.
That's cool. That's an interesting fact.
It could have so easily been turned into a horror story, though.
Well, it definitely has some like dark underpinnings to it that
It's
are
about
very
a boy
Stephen
that gets
King.
a gun, he shoots a rifle gang, and has to hide all their bodies.
Tyler, have you seen this movie before?
I have seen bits and parts of it, bits and pieces. God, audience, I would just like to reach out to you and say that I have messed up almost every single thing I've said today, so you have to apologize. Oh my god, I apologize in advance. I've seen parts of this movie. I feel like when I was little, it was on TV, and I was uncomfortable with the idea of watching a movie with children smoking in it, and so that like really turned me off to the film, and so it was until this very moment that I decided that I should probably just watch it, considering it was the homework. So
That's an interesting point to bring up. So this movie came out in 1986, but it's depicting 1959. Even on its release in 86, it was an R-rated movie. And I think that's one of the things that I find so interesting about Stand By Me, is that it's a movie about children, and it's kind of like a coming-of-age movie that, you know, these movies are generally pitched towards young people, but this is an R-rated movie, and there's tons of swearing and smoking and drinking. It's actually pretty filthy for what it is.
Which is funny that I can recall watching this as a kid.
Right? Like, my mom showed me this movie. It's like one of her favorite movies of all time. I was probably too young to have seen it.
That's definitely true. Goodness gracious. Well, I feel like that probably everyone just like lets you watch it, just like The Simpsons, where it's like a movie, like a program that was like, nobody's dying in it. They're not like having sex, so I guess it's okay.
Yeah, there are definitely some lines in here, though, that, especially on this most recent rewatching, I was like, man, I probably did not get that joke the first few times I saw this movie. So, the 4 boys in the movie, the main cast, you have Gordon, or Gordy, played by Will Wheaton, who's the narrator of the film. He's kind of a quiet kid. He's a writer. His older brother died a few months before the events of the movie take place, and he's going through some trouble at home with his parents grieving and everything. Then you have River Phoenix's character Chris, who comes from a bad family and has some issues with stealing and is just kind of a rebel. And then Teddy. Teddy's father is a war veteran with some psychological issues who abused Teddy when he was a small child, so Teddy's kind of like the crazy kid, and then Vern is the lovable fat kid that can't do anything right. One of the reasons that I think I loved this movie so much, particularly in my teenage years, is that I feel like I had all of these kids as friends. I'm curious from you guys, is there anybody, either the 3 of us on the podcast or people that we knew, that you see in these characters before I tell you what I think?
Not really. Not anybody that, like... I honestly really answered this question in my head. Like, who do I see? So I'm going to go with
At the age that they were also... Or just in general, just like at maybe a later point.
Just in general.
I mean, we could probably loosely correlate it to the 4 or 5 of us in band at some point. But I mean, like pre that, I would say that I didn't actually have a whole lot of like consistent friend groups that I really like lived in. You know, kind of like. Especially like in elementary and middle school, like I had just had like I lived on like a street with no kids on it, so I never really got to have this kind of adventures.
I think that's interesting, Tyler, because I definitely grew up on a street with a bunch of kids my age. That's part of the reason that I feel like this movie resonates for me, is because I had a lot of these experiences, and I had it like a kid in the neighborhood who was kind of like Teddy. But the one that always stuck out in my mind was, I feel like, friend of the show, Kevin Vance, was Vern.
And who was
the
Vern
chubby
again?
kid who brings the comb and like doesn't know the secret knock to the treehouse.
Oh, Kevin.
That's so funny because it's like it's interesting what happens like when you're a kid and then when you grow up, because Kevin's definitely not that person, I feel like, anymore.
No, but at the time.
No.
Yeah.
Definitely not, but yeah, I can see that. But I think that's what makes him such a good Vern, is because like I remember Kevin like that, and like that's why I loved Kevin.
Yeah, and I think that's
then and now is
I think that's part of the charm of this movie, is that every friend group had like a Vern in it. You know, it becomes very easy to map these characters to people you actually know. And they're all just specific enough to be interesting, but just vague enough to be like, yeah, that could totally be like one of my friends, you know? Let's actually walk through the movie now that we've waxed poetic about it. So the movie kicks off with the kids hanging out in their treehouse, and I guess they're playing poker. It's not really clear, but they're smoking cigarettes in the very first scene, which I know is something that Tyler already mentioned. And I think one of my favorite things about this movie is how mean the kids are to each other at times. Like, they're still friends, but they, like, rag on each other. And this is, like, made very clear from the very beginning, where one of them beats the other one in cards, and he tells him to piss up a rope. And it's just, like, it's such a good, like, kid in, like, drag, you know?
Yeah. Because it just means, like, what does that even mean?
Well, I'll let you work that one out on your own, Tyler.
All right, well, okay. BRB, I'm going to not pay attention anymore.
But the plot proper kicks off when Vern shows up and says that he overheard his older brother saying that they know where the body is. And so they decide that they're going to lie to their parents and say they're sleeping at one person's house, and that person's going to say that they're sleeping at another person's house, and instead they're all going to go down the train tracks and try and find this dead kid's body. Which sounds like the sort of harebrained scheme that we probably would have come up with in high school, to be completely honest.
Remember that time we came home from being out of my house? My mom was sitting there in the dark and she turned the light on, and Tyler was afraid of her for like...
Literally never went back.
To this day. That's what I mean. Like... This is just such a universal story.
That's funny to think about.
That's right. My mom just wanted to make sure he didn't fall in a ditch.
My mom was going to leave us in one.
Yeah, she was not about to come out and look for us. They were going to be talking about us on the radio.
Which is how we found such a balanced childhood.
Yeah. So the kids prep to go on their trip, and they have this whole like packing scene with this really great moment for Will Wheaton's character where he gets to reminisce about his dead brother. I feel like that scene's really acted well, but it's not like super integral. The next scene though.
Well, if it wasn't integral, they sure do like to remind you about it. If
I mean, it's important. It's important to his character. Like,
yeah.
The movie is largely about learning to cope with death. Like all of these scenes with Gordon's brother are, you know, the literal, like, driving home that he's not mourning his brother's death very well. But it's definitely not, like, it's not a last scene. It's not one of the things that you remember from this movie.
Right.
The next scene, though, I will always remember when they meet... Gordon meets up with Chris, and they've got all their camping gear packed up, and Chris takes him back into the alley and shows him that he has the gun. And he gives Gordon the gun. And he's like, this isn't loaded, right? And then immediately it goes off and, like, shoots a trash can, right? It's kind of on par with, like, that time that Shawn and Greg blew up Greg's driveway.
Yeah.
No. Tony blew up Greg's driveway. Shawn and Greg were just there.
Well, yes. But I can just see you and Greg like, it's not loaded. Gun immediately goes off.
Don't paint us like that. Don't paint Greg and I as having this, like, dangerous outlaw childhood because it wasn't like that.
Well, just imagine if you were really bored and, like, you didn't have...
It still would not have come to that. It doesn't matter what you say. It would not have come to that. There was no firearms anywhere in my childhood. With the exception of going shooting with Boy Scouts, that was it.
It's a great moment in the movie, though. After that, we get our first run-in with Kiefer Sutherland as Ace, who steals the baseball cap that Gordon got from his older brother and throws Chris down on the street and tries to burn him with a cigarette. And I love Kiefer Sutherland in this movie. I feel like he's a really awesome villain. But I'm also watching this scene now and thinking, like, how is he just doing this on a street in broad daylight?
No one gives a shit.
Rated R.
Yeah,
Rated
but
R,
where
man.
are all the adults in this movie?
They're all in their dens drinking scotch. Duh. What year was this? 1860? I don't know. Having a square dance with George Washington. Duh.
Oh my god, shut up. But at the end of that scene, there's this really great moment where the two, Gordon and Chris, are walking down the street, and they linger on the shot for a really long time, just so that you can see Chris kick Gordon in the ass, and then Gordon kick Chris in the ass as they're walking, which feels on par with, like, you know, there's a lot of little, like, violent kid games in this movie, like Two for Flinching and things like that I just remember so much about being that age.
Yeah, which is weird, and it's just something that I just was, as a kid, I just never was very fond of. I'm like, why do we gotta hit each other? Why do we gotta beat each other up?
Only child.
I know. That was my problem.
I think that's what it is. Shawn and I both had brothers, so we were used to that.
Why do we have to have tactile pleasure? I don't understand why touching is a big thing. I never got hugged.
Oh no, you got me, Shawn. You caught me red-handed.
No, I didn't, because no one ever touched you.
We're ignoring the whole, like, touching moment where they, like, for, like, 10 minutes, they're like, do you, like, fucking swear on everyone that's ever lived in your family will ever die in your family, in your sister's, uncle's, brother's grave? You're like, yeah, man, let's...
No, there is a lot of that stuff, too. And pinky swears, and
I was like, it got me so invested in Chris at a very early stage of the movie, because I was like, well, he's not a shitty kid. I think he was my favorite character because I feel like you really could sympathize with his struggle, and you could, like, despite his poor upbringing, he still is a good person. He has, like, value, and you're like, oh, great, I can't wait to watch this unfold.
yeah, and it's so good to see him, like, you see him bring out the gun, and you're like, well, this is gonna go a direction. And then, like, in the very next scene, he is defending Gordon against the movie's main antagonist, like, and he doesn't make it violent or anything. He's just, like, being very vocal and telling him to go away. Like, you really get the sense that Chris has a heart of gold in that moment, which is kind of a cool scene. So they get to the railroad tracks. They meet up with the other two kids. They're talking about how long it's going to take and how it's going to be hard. And Vern is like, we could just hitchhike. We'd get there in like an hour. And I think one of my favorite lines in this whole movie, Teddy just looks at him and says, did your mother ever have any kids that lived? That's just such an intense burn so early in this movie. And it sounds like the sort of thing that Shawn would say to me.
No, that's not true. I wouldn't have said that to you. I would have been the guy that was, like, standing drunk in a bar in graduate school yelling, "Chopper sick balls." That would have been my notable line from this movie. Just watching a fight out on the street, knowing I was protected behind, like, bodyguards and a, like, thick glass, and, like at a hockey game, and just banging the glass and yelling, "Chopper sick balls."
That's a classic line.
So Shawn has bypassed any of the pivotal main characters and has decided to
only identify with the junkyard man.
Exactly.
I identify with apparently all the train workers who just are like, well, I mean, we can't really stop this train. We got somewhere to be. So I guess I'm just going to keep going and run over these kids. That's my character. That's my spirit animal. Since we're apparently just picking our, like, third string, like, fighter game characters in this movie, apparently.
Well, we didn't throw the spoiler horn yet, but I guess there are no spoilers for a movie that's 31 years old.
It's older than me.
You know what this movie kind of reminded me of in some ways? A bachelor party.
Really?
Yeah.
Why do you say that?
Because they're reminiscing. They're on a little adventure. They're out there, like, by themselves. I don't know. It just kind of reminds me of that.
See, for me, my next note chronologically in the movie is, this movie is basically our podcast in the 50s. There's this conversation shortly after they start walking where I don't remember which ones it is, but a couple of kids are like, do you think Mighty Mouse could beat up Superman? And one of them says, of course not. Mighty Mouse is a cartoon and Superman's a real guy. And I was like, yeah.
No, that sounds dead on.
I was like, yeah, that's basically our podcast.
Corey Feldman's character sucks.
Teddy, you're not a fan?
No. I mean, I get it. You can't like every character, right? But it's like, oh god, just consistently having no redeeming qualities. But that's beside the point. I'm sorry, that was a derail.
He's the crazy kid. He's trying to dodge trains and fight in the war, man.
Train!
That's right. It's the real villain of this movie.
Yeah, so they get to the railroad bridge, and they're like, we could go down to another bridge that's more safe. And Teddy's like, nah, it's gonna take forever. Let's just cross this bridge. There won't be a train. And of course, there's a train.
There's always a train.
There's always a train.
That's a metaphor for life. That's like a Rick and Morty style lesson right here. There's always a train.
That part does give another of my favorite little lines in this movie, though, where they're arguing about whether or not to go across the bridge, and Teddy says, "You guys can go ahead and do that, and while you're taking forever to do whatever, I'll be sitting on the other side of the bridge, relaxing with my thoughts." And Will Wheaton's character just says, "Do you use your right hand or your left hand for that?" Like, another great little kid, like, teenager burn, but it's just so subtly, like, slid in there, and then they go across the bridge as if the line never happened. Those sorts of lines are really, like, my favorite part of this movie.
Yeah, and it's like, I feel like in some ways you're like, well, I feel like you're right, that was an interesting moment where they just kind of just like, well, we're done with that joke. And it didn't feel like awkward. They just kind of the movie kept going. But it feels like a movie that would be like made like now would be like really like drag that on for like another like 10 minutes. And so I really have to compliment that it's like a movie that doesn't when you really look at it doesn't sound very real, but it feels very real.
Yeah, the dialogue is written so realistically that you forgive all of the moments where it's like overly earnest and cutesy and whatnot.
I would say it's more convincing than realistic. You're like you're immersed. You feel like
you know this world, yeah.
Like you're part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey everybody, it's Taylor here. And if you want to spend just a little more time with our panel, we've started live streaming ourselves playing Jackbox party games over on twitch.tv/dudesbrunch. We're live every Thursday night at 8 with more antics, hilarity, and bad jokes. So after they're running with the train, we of course get Shawn's favorite part of this movie, all of the stuff in the junkyard. I think as a kid, I thought the whole thing of Chopper the junkyard dog was a lot funnier. Watching that whole part now, it just feels like they took the whole plot of the Sandlot and summed it up in about 10 minutes.
Sounds right.
Why always places gotta have junkyards?
The junkyard dog is scary. We run from the junkyard dog. It turns out the junkyard dog wasn't scary all along. Hey, look, I just ended the Sandlot.
And everybody does something real cool, being a lawyer.
Yep, that's right. So they go camping after they're done at the junkyard. And all the campsite scenes I really like because it gives us another opportunity to just sit with these characters and let them talk to each other. And they do this, like, little montage of conversations that they all have, like, if I can only eat one food for the rest of my life, obviously it would be cherry-flavored Pez. Or, Wagon Train is a great show, but did you ever notice that they don't ever get anywhere? They're always just wagon training. And, like, all of those little beats, I'm just like, this, again, is our podcast in movie form.
Except nobody likes Pez.
Oh, Shawn, are you going to come to the defense of Pez?
No.
You're not a Pez fan?
No. We're talking about the candy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Now, Dude Brunch goes to bat for ska, but we don't.
No.
But not. Well, I do. I go to bat for ska. You back the fuck up.
We all know how I feel about. I'm a rock and roll Puritan, so.
He likes that knee-length skirt. That's with his rock and roll.
Listen, the only time a trumpet was okay in rock and roll is if you're George R.R. Martin and not the Game of Thrones one.
Wait. What does that mean?
Boom! Super deep reference. If you got that, you win.
So, after all of this jokey conversation around the campfire, we have what's probably the most unconventional thing in this movie. Will Wheaton's character, Gordon, gets to tell a story around the campfire, and they just do a whole aside. Like, they just kind of reroute the movie to tell this little story that Will Wheaton has come up with about a fat kid nicknamed Lard Ass who eats a bunch of pie. Every time...
Doesn't he explode?
The weirdest transition there. I was like, this is totally strange.
How do you guys feel about the Lard Ass story?
You should go over it for our listeners.
Basically what happens is there's a pie eating contest and the town enters Lard Ass because he's fat and pie eating contest. And everybody makes fun of him and calls him Lard Ass. And so it turns out that right before he goes on stage for the pie eating contest, he drinks an entire bottle of castor oil and then proceeds to throw up pie all over everyone, and everybody else starts throwing up, and the story ends with just everyone puking everywhere.
It really felt... the way that everyone was just, like, throwing up was very, like... like Django Unchained, like with the blood spurting, like very like. God, who's the creator of those?
Quentin Tarantino.
Quentin Tarantino's. Yeah, like he's been doing that kind of like projectile like blood splatter recently, because like that also happened in the his most recent one, the
Hateful Eight.
Listen,
yeah.
Tarantino loves a good blood splattering. That's always how his movies have operated.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. The story just, even now, having seen this movie so many times, the story just feels so different from the rest of the movie.
Yes, Taylor. Anyway, so I think what's interesting about that is that it feels so totally, completely different from this movie. It's just like so out of left field. You're like, where did this come from? Why did this happen? Why did they include this? Do you like, as like someone that has studied film to some degree, do you have any idea, like, sort of like maybe why that was included?
There's definitely an element of they want to show that Gordy is a good storyteller, because there's this ongoing thing in the plot of like Gordy thinks that he's no good because his older brother was really popular and played football, and his parents are not acknowledging him because they miss his departed brother.
Oh, right, yeah.
But I feel like they totally could have conveyed that without, spending 5 minutes on this story. Or by having him tell a story that was more similar to the movie in tone. Yeah.
I guess in some ways, I mean, for a small child, I guess that's kind of appropriate, I guess, because it's kind of gross, so maybe that's fine. But like, yeah, I definitely, I don't know what kind of story I would have him tell instead that would feel like that would fit better with the story. Like you don't want it to just like repeat what their adventure is right now, because that technically wouldn't be a very good story.
Right.
So, but I guess it's fine. I guess I was just curious to see if there's any like if how he felt, if it was I don't know. I guess appropriate. I don't know what I'm trying to say. It was a strange detour, that story, and I feel like I don't think it took away, but I think it certainly brought me out of the emotional context of the movie. I feel like it kind of took me to a different place, and I had to kind of get back into a different place again, because it almost immediately gets a little bit darker after that,
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, is it feels like the movie just gets so serious in the moments right after that story. Like, that's when they hear the hyenas, and so they decide that they're going to start doing watch overnight, and you end up with just Chris and Gordon being awake at one point, and they have this really intense, heartfelt conversation about, like, Gordon's parents don't care about him, and the whole town doesn't care about Chris, and, like, this really loaded conversation that's been happening throughout the movie, but it happens again here, where they're talking about how Chris is going to have to go to shop classes while Gordon goes to college prep classes in the fall. Mm-hmm. Which is such an interesting component of this movie, too, that, this was a time in our education system where there was a huge separation between vocational education and, like, college prep, and there were a lot more people doing vocational ed than there are now.
And that's so interesting because it feels so reversed now. Like, if I were to go back to school, if I was high school all over again, I would much more likely want to get a vocational job, because that means I wouldn't have to deal with, that long climb. But I guess at that point, people would just, you got a degree, you get a nice, easy job real quick, So I think it was interesting to sort of look back to see how it was even different writing the story from the 80s back into the 50s. And it kind of gives an interesting context, an interesting viewpoint for today.
Yeah, there are a lot of parts of this movie where I feel like the fact that it's an 80s movie about the 50s really shines through, but that conversation in particular, I think, is a really good example. Mm-hmm. And it's really like that conversation feels kind of like cheap and cheesy at points. Chris tells Gordon that his dad doesn't really know him at one point. I don't remember if it's there or if it's at the end of the movie when they have basically the same conversation. But it feels manufactured, but it also doesn't, right? Because I feel like those are the kinds of conversations that kids that age would be having. Mm-hmm. But some of the lines of dialogue there, for some reason, I feel like just haven't aged as well as other parts of the movie.
Well, I thought that it definitely felt more mature than their age, which I think is fine. It's kind of that feeling again of, it's a movie, like, you don't have to write kids as kids as annoying and stupid and bad like how most movies write them nowadays. Well, mainstream, very popular movies. So it was actually good to have like Chris be like this wise figure who like he had a rough upbringing, but he's still like he's like so like wise beyond his years, and I think that's really compelling. And I feel like everyone wants to have that kind of friend. That's someone that's like willing to just say the right thing to really like get you out of where your bad place and get you back into like believe in yourself and really pushing you forward, really bringing you up. So I think, for me, it did a lot. I was very compelled by what he said, even if you think, like, how did you feel like it was manufactured? Like, if you could even, like, quantify that, like, can you kind of explain how you felt that was manufactured, just the kind of the way it was brought up, I guess?
No, there's this line, and I'm trying really hard to place where it happens, because they have this conversation a couple times, but I think it's at this point in the movie, at night, where Chris tells Gordon, if your parents don't give a shit about you, then maybe I should, or something to that effect. But like the way he words it is very like paternal, and it feels kind of like an adult talking down to a child. And I think it's just a moment of like, at a lot of points in this movie, it feels like the kid actors really believe what they're saying and really like have experience that matches up with the script. But this one part, I'm just like, I just don't believe this coming out of this kid's mouth.
I think that's fair. It was also, I think it was a weird sentiment, but I liked the idea behind it.
Oh yeah, I love the idea behind it, but I do think that like, yeah, it's kind of a weird sentiment. I don't know, Shawn, does the earnestness of these conversations bother you?
The fact that they're like 12 years old?
Yeah, they're 12 years old and they're like having these deep heart-to-hearts about their parents and like self-worth and all of these things. Like, does it seem plausible or believable to you?
Maybe in some respects, yeah. I mean, it's a movie that's clearly written for adults. It's about kids. And I think if they were having like kids conversations, which they kind of do like childish things.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have been that good of a hit. Like, it wouldn't have been even a believable Stephen King short story, right? Because like it's just, let's talk about farts, like it just wouldn't be. It wouldn't be Stand By Me. It would just be like,
it would be The Sandlot,
right? It would be like A Christmas Story, like an 80s movie about the 50s. That's what it would be. And like, so yeah, I mean, I think it almost has to be that way. I never really thought about it too much. Granted, I haven't seen this movie in like 7 or 8, 10, 15 years, but I don't know. I don't see why they can't have deep conversations. I mean, it's not like when you were kids you didn't have like a deep conversation or two. It's a movie, so of course you get like all the impactful ones the whole line, the whole single time, but like...
Right.
Yeah, I definitely remember having conversations like this with my friends as kids.
Maybe Oregon preteens are just like really emotionally evolved,
Maybe.
And so like at that point, well, maybe like having those kinds of movies can allow kids to watch it and then be like, oh, you can have that level of maturity and depth. Like if you read a lot of books when you're a kid, you probably like reasonably more read, and you probably know probably a lot more things than most other kids. Like if you're just reading like all the time, and so that I think that enables people to be more emotionally mature, and that's probably good. I would imagine it's better than the baby drool like animated movies that they're good works of art, but I don't think they have the same impact as like this movie in particular.
Yeah, like everyone's seen a Miyazaki movie. They know what garbage animation and crap storyline looks like.
Yeah, like those are great movies. Very good, and I'm sure... Wait, were you saying those are bad movies, Shawn? Is that what you...
Did you just say that?
And you read it... You read into that one so well. You were like so into it. Like,
delivery service.
You heard me say Miyazaki, and you just like went on that tangent. Like nothing bad is gonna come out of his mouth, and I totally just said. I just badmouthed this. Every one of those movies, and
why you little?
I was just like, yeah, those are great. Those are the best, and I really did. I really do like them. I was just messing around.
He was about ready to throw down.
Hold my beer.
I'm glad that you were developing a new like a good response to that, regardless of what came out of my mouth.
No, I think you're right though. Like as awkward as some of these moments are, it is what separates this movie, right? It's what keeps it from being, I don't know, like it's what keeps it from being a Disney movie.
Yeah, and I think maybe too that was like a good. There was a reason for that because maybe it just goes to like basic psychology where it's like you remember when we were growing up and we saw these toy commercials. Like, the kids that play with the toys are always older than the demographic that would normally play with them, right? Like, It always seems like there's, like, a 20-something playing with sock and boppers, you know? Mm-hmm. It's not actually, like, someone who's, like, 8. It's, like, you know, somebody who's in high school and they're, like, having a good time. And you're like, that's, yeah. You know? And then, like, now that we're older, it's, like, all these nice people that are, like, having retirement accounts and, like, taking prescription drugs. You know, like, we watch TV and we're like, we could do that. We could go to our doctors on a regular basis. We could meet with somebody who advises us on what to do with our extra money. Like, yeah.
Yeah, there's a word for this in media studies. It's called watching up. The idea that people watch media that's an age bracket above their actual age. It's part of the reason why Friends was as successful as it was. And I think...
There we go.
Yeah, this movie is kind of the inverse, though, right? Because it's watching down. Like, it's a movie for adults about children.
Right, but the dialogue is clearly watching up.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe watching down, listening up.
Yeah, there you go. The next morning, there's this scene that I think this movie has a lot of great points. This scene is probably not one of them. Gordon is the only one awake, and he sees a deer, and the deer walks off into the forest. And then there's this little narration comes in that says, I never told the other guys about the deer. That's the one part of the story I kept to myself until now. And then it just moves on to the next scene. And I'm sure it's supposed to, like, convey Gordy's innocence and whatnot. But it just feels way too on the nose for me. And it also kind of feels like the movie just needed to remind you that there was a narrator because he hasn't been involved for the last half hour. Did anybody else get that feeling?
Well... To be fair, no one in the movie was making egregiously, like, contradictory statements about, like, building a wall in Mexico or wandering muddy, so the narrator probably didn't feel like he had to step in and say anything, so...
You would take a crap on everyday magic, too. Like, nothing special for you. Like, a butterfly lands on your nose, and you're, like, immediately on Twitter, like, a butterfly landed on my nose! There's no subtlety with your life.
That's the thing, though. I don't think it was subtle. I think it's like, you know,
a little too on the nose.
Yeah, it's smacking you in the face with, look at his childlike innocence.
Maybe it was a special moment. Maybe he was tapping into a subconscious yearning to be alone when he's surrounded all the time, like all of us.
I think you watched a different movie than me, Shawn.
I also like the part where Shawn literally just fucking grilled me, like, threw my, like, fucking nuts on the grill and just be like, you post everything about your life on social media. Thanks, Shawn.
Sorry.
I keep many thoughts to myself. It also doesn't help that I happen to have a podcast that I record every week where I get an opportunity to say my feelings, so...
Doesn't that make you feel special, though? Like, that's a moment that you have, and it's just, like, a you moment. You know you think that.
What's going on?
Oh, my God.
Let's get to what we came here for. The next morning, the kids go see the dead body. And when they see the body, Gordon has a breakdown because he's been suppressing the death of his brother this whole time. And Chris comforts him. And then Ace shows up, and the gang is there, and there's an argument, and Ace pulls a knife, and then Gordon pulls the gun, and he shoots it in the air. And makes Ace run away. And they decide not to take the body of the kid and to call in an anonymous tip to the police because they don't feel like anybody should get him. The ending of this movie, I think, it really surprised me when I watched it for the first time as a kid because it escalates so quickly. Like, it was such a happy-go-lucky movie, and there's only, like, one point before this where they kind of get somber about the fact that, you know, the whole movie is about a dead kid. And then as soon as they get to the body, it's like the whole mood of the movie shifts. And it lightens up a couple of times for jokes, but it really, like, it doesn't really go back to what it was before. It's I think that's what makes it such a successful coming-of-age movie, is that it shifts in tone in a way that feels impactful and feels like there's no coming back from it. Like, these kids will still be funny and they'll still be friends, but it's not going to be the same now that they've seen this dead body.
I mean, yeah. I mean, on top of everything that they've already encountered, they had, like, 2 or 3 near-death experiences.
This is also true.
Compacted into, like, 2 days. So they're like, maybe we should just live boring lives now. Maybe we should just stay at home.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like, once again, this is a movie where you look down and listen up. Like, there's a lot of friendships that have, like, experiences like this. Maybe not so much when you're young, but maybe so when you're older, where, like, something bad happens, and it kind of changes the way that everything goes down. You know, like, everything, it kind of solidifies a moment. And honestly, I'm trying to think right now if we as a group ever had a moment like this, and I don't think that we ever did.
I think we did.
What would you say it was?
Well, so I think there are 2 ways to look at it. If you're thinking of, like, a short period of time where a bunch of meaningful stuff happened and we remember it super well, I think the 4th of July weekend we all spent together falls into that category. But we went through a whole lot of stuff, like right when you went away to college and I graduated from high school, where we had a lot of problems in our friend group and a lot of disagreements and some really intense falling out that I think we came out of very different on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wasn't there for that.
Well, you were there for I think the moment in some way or another was the friend split, was the schism. Well, there was an entire podcast about this entire story that has been recounted for the internet to
if you're interested in the internet, you can go listen to Dude's Brunch episode 10. It's a 2-parter where we talk about all this stuff. But I think you're right, Shawn, and I think that's one of the things that makes me come back to this movie over and over again, is that feeling of, like, these friendships are never going to be the same, and that's okay. It ends on a dark note, but it's also kind of a reassuring note, right? That, like, the 2 of them end up making it through this. The other 2 kids kind of fall off by the wayside, but Gordon and Chris remain friends for the rest of their life. It's just different.
Yeah.
And there's also an interesting discussion to be had, too, about, the movie is also about the first time that these kids see a dead body. And it's that, like, adolescent coming to terms with death, like, the first time somebody around you dies and you have to go to a funeral and that sort of thing. Which I think is something that I hadn't seen in a movie until I saw this. Because, like, in Disney movies, parents die at the beginning of movies all the time. Like, Mufasa dies and all this stuff. But you don't have to deal with grieving in a Disney movie the way that you do in Stand By Me.
Well, except for, in Up, where they just punch you right in the dick right at the beginning, and they just...
It's all grieving for like 5 minutes.
They make sure to roll that throughout the entire movie. They're like, hey, don't you forget about this shit.
So what's the most memorable thing about this movie for you guys? What really, like, stands out in your mind coming away from this?
Chopper sick ball. It's just a classic line.
I mean, it is real good, even though he doesn't actually say.
I don't remember this. Yeah, I mean, what does he say then?
Well,
that's the joke, is that he says sick 'em, but all the kids think he says sick balls.
I like all the crying. That's my favorite part.
Oh my god.
Because that affects me on that resonates with me on an emotional level.
There is a lot of crying in this movie.
Yeah. I just like really just my favorite part of the movie is just Chris.
Just in general?
Yeah, I think he's just a character that just really resonated really well with me, that I really just enjoyed a lot. A good friend, someone that sticks up for people. I don't know. It was just, for some reason at this age, at this time in my life, it just really resonated well with me. I'm sure there's some funny haha moments, but that's the kind of the part that's probably going to stick with me best.
I mean, I quote a lot of lines from this movie pretty often, but one of the things that's always stuck with me about it is the music. Mm-hmm. This is clearly a movie where music, it's not about music, and there's a lot of music in it, but it's not prominent to the plot. It's just clear that these characters and these writers love music. And there are a lot of great little moments of, like, characters singing songs together or, like, lip syncing to the radio. And the soundtrack to it is just, like, solid gold 50s jukebox hits, like Lollipop and Johnny Be Good and all this stuff. And a lot of these songs I still, like, when I hear them on the radio, I immediately associate them with whatever scene they're in this movie. It's just kind of burned these songs into my brain, and I love it for that. And that's part of the reason why I like watching it in the summer, too, because it takes place in the summer, and these songs are so summery, and it just... It occupies that place in my brain.
And I think that's good when you can make a soundtrack that feels very of the era and really allows you to kind of go back for people that haven't listened to the songs before, that didn't grow up during that time period. It contextualizes it really well for you. We actually had, we usually play a menagerie of things at the Rook on the radio, but yesterday we listened to a bunch of classic rock stuff, and I was like, man, this is really gelling with me, but if we listen to this another weekend back to back, I'm gonna leave. Because I think that's the kind of the magic, is that it's like, these songs are great and they're amazing and they're some of the best of all time, but like, you gotta use them carefully. You can't just use them whenever the fuck, you know, like, you have to really know when's the right time, and so I think this is an example of a movie that knew how to use them well. Update, piss on a rope, or piss up a rope. Man, I didn't get a strong explanation, considering the first answer was Urban Dictionary and then Wikitory.
Tyler, I don't think you need to use Google to solve this problem. I want you to think about what little physics you probably studied in, like, 8th grade science.
And
imagine what would happen if you attempted to piss up a rope.
It probably wouldn't work very well. It'd probably be pretty hard. Probably get all over yourself. Probably. Oh.
There it is. He got it.
Him.
He finally got it. It's time to end the show like we always do with a round of shameless plugs. We're going to start it off with Tyler Reed. Tyler, do you want to be the Lone Ranger or the Cisco Kid?
I guess I want to be the Lone Ranger. That sounds good. Hey, everybody. You can find my design and illustration work at tylerdreed.com. And you can find me on the socials as TDR Design on Instagram and Twitter. Working on some new animations. Going to Gen Con soon. If you're going to Gen Con, hit me up. Big board game convention in Indianapolis. Let me tell you my exact locations on my Snapchat geofilter.
Shawn Evans, I think you would win in a fight against Mighty Mouse.
He's a mouse.
That's right.
But he's also very strong.
So once again, you can find me on Twitter at sevans8910 or on Snapchat at that same handle, 78910.
You can find me on the socials as at TC Olmstead. You can follow and like the show. We are at Dudes Brunch. Leave us a review on iTunes if you like us. That would be sweet. You can also check us out on Twitch. We're live streaming video games there on Thursdays. And we have a subreddit too. And then we will see you again next week for another episode of Dudes Brunch.
I did find out, though, we have learned in the past couple weeks that my cat is friends with our coffee table, which, as you know, is like a cowhide, like cowskin table. And she, like, wakes up and she, like, goes out and she greets the coffee table. She, like, rubs up against it and, like, purrs at it. And then she, like, before she goes to bed, she, like, comes over and, like, loves on the coffee table and, like, puts her scent on it and stuff. And this weekend I was sweeping the carpet, so I took it and I put it up on the chair, and she came out and it was up high, and she freaked out. She got all up in like scared cat stance, and she just like was like, "Oh my god, this cat's gonna kill me. Table's gonna kill me." So they must have a very complicated relationship, this coffee table and my cat.